All right, welcome back, everybody. Thank you for joining us once again on day 2 of our developmental stages and importance of individualism and coaching the brain. So back with us is Trisha Turns, our wonderful guest, and joining us today and talking a lot about the development of not only boys and girls, but that kind of fluidity between the two and the brain that kind of really exists that we really need to be more aware of. So as we kind of get into it today, we're going to really focus on the teenage years, the adolescence, the teenage, the kind of post-teenager, and as well as young adults, and what those stages look like, and why we do the things they do, or not we, but why do teenagers and adolescents do the things they do? Sometimes reckless, sometimes, not even thinking about consequences. We touched on this a little bit yesterday, but we're really going to focus on some of that today and the reasoning why. So as we move forward, we'll kind of just preview today about what that looks like, right? The understanding how the identity, their ability, and their body, it all kind of are woven together in their self kind of awareness and their kind of pieces. And so we talk about teenagers and adolescents and thinking about where they're at, not only physically, but mentally. They're still trying to figure out who they are, right? And so when we're doing that attempt of, we have to coach you, we have to continue to motivate you, that could change from one day to the next, right? Depending on their hormones, depending on their mood, depending on what's happening at home, these things will shift very quickly, very fast, and sometimes out of the blue. And so we have to be responsive to that. So when we coach this age, it's almost more important to have those relationships built prior, just because of how important it is that they can then trust you. They can then say, I want to be vulnerable with you and have those conversations. Like, I'm not into it today, or I'm not, I can't seem to get my head around what's going on at home, or what's going on at school, or what's going on with this social group. And, sometimes sport is that release, or that vehicle for them to really allow their frustrations and their kind of abilities just to kind of let go. So as we kind of talk a little bit about it today, thinking about where teenagers are at, who you're coaching, and your intent, right? I think we touched on it a little bit yesterday. I think we really want to focus it on more today, just because when we see these changes, we really have to think about what we're saying. We have to be intentional with our words, our body language, our coaching mechanisms, our techniques. The way we do things as role models for these student athletes is a huge proponent on our influence and their kind of perception of us and their perception on the world. So they're absorbing everything at a high, quick, and fast rate. So we just need to make sure that we're adjusting our coaching and our kind of education to that level. Is there anything you want to add, Trish?
Just looking at the or thinking about the like the way when you said the response, right? Your response is everything to some of the changes that are happening or that you start to notice. Really, it's just about like noticing nuanced things that are happening. And sometimes it's about the things that are not said, right? The things that are not brought up. And it's noticing things like body language, physiology, breath, heightened breath, or like a look of panic, or any anxiety that you see. So it's just having the awareness of what we're talking about today is just going to help you to respond in such a better way.
Right. And I think really we have to focus on ourselves as coaches too, right? We have to understand,
yes,
who we are, and if we're coachable. If we can't coach ourselves, if we don't have that self-awareness, if we don't hold status in the highest regard or our position, what does it look like to the team, and what does it look like to ourselves? And being able to convey that same message, not only for ourselves, but to the team as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we even talked about just like a scenario, of like, let's say the coach is frustrated and they come into the locker room and start chastising the team because of a poor play that they made. Like, we're not working hard enough. Our teamwork is horrible today. This is unacceptable. And then all of a sudden, like, a female will respond to that differently than a male. And a lot of times there's things that aren't said in that. And sometimes there's things that are said in that. The female might think, oh my gosh, like, the coach is talking to me, like, he thinks I'm not working hard enough, I'm letting him down. And a male might respond in that way as well, depending on whether they have masculine or feminine, right? It doesn't matter. Anybody's going to respond differently, but noticing, like, noticing the engagement and the focus of that, and how you're speaking and how people are responding to you as you speak, really starts to create an open floor. Like, we have to create that conversation around what's going on. Otherwise we can't move anybody forward. We want to make sure that we're getting our message across to the team in a way that we really want it to be. Because
Right.
it's not that you really think that they're not working hard enough and they need to work harder. Yes, you want that, but how do you actually elicit and influence them to do that? And you're going to be able to influence adolescents into young adults into college athletes differently across the board, based on their developmental stage, based on male or female, all those things.
Yeah, I remember, coaches growing up, if they came in saying that, I'm like, yeah, Mikey over there is definitely not working hard enough. I'm working way harder, and really not taking that onus or responsibility. And I think that is definitely a part of the problem. But at the same time, we have to understand that most boys, or a lot of masculine mentalities, are not going to accept that responsibility because they don't want to take that ownership. They don't want to put that responsibility on themselves or that accountability. So we have to kind of teach those things and say, this is a team dynamic, and we have to make sure that everybody on the team is on that same page. And I think that's where, sometimes during this age, where coaching females might be, more effective because of their team identity, and they identify more with a team than they do individually. And I think that's
Yeah.
where we start really bridging that gap. So that's kind of why we focus on this stage a lot, is when this development happens, and when females hit puberty, or they're going through this, there's a lot of changes happening, not only physically and emotionally, but all this stuff with the social dynamic piece too. And Trish, I'll let you kind of get into this, but
Yeah.
I really think when these females who hit puberty much earlier than males, technically speaking, or scientifically speaking, I should say, on average, they're going to, see the differences a lot faster, and they're going to notice it, and they're going to feel much different because their male counterparts or their female counterparts may not be experiencing the same things they do, or maybe not experience the same emotions they're feeling, just because that puberty is such a tough and awkward stage in everybody's life. So, I'm not going to say I had a comfortable time going through puberty and, doing that, but we as females and males always feel alone in that sense, right? Because nobody's comfortable talking about some of these changes that are actually happening.
Well, I wouldn't say that no one is,
Well,
but that's this culture though, right? That's, you're even speaking it. It's like our culture here in the States is to, and in many cultures, is to not talk about it. It's kind of like this, hidden thing that happens. And even I'm learning things right now in my 30s that I wished my mom had taught me back in the day. Like, I grew up like this, it was all hush hush. Like, nobody taught me how to shave my legs, how to put a tampon in. Like, nobody taught me that stuff. And yeah, I hate to bring it up, but it's the truth. And that kind of stuff can really make a girl feel uncomfortable when she goes through that stage of not really understanding what's happening to her body, right? It totally changes the dynamic. It makes her think differently of herself when she's not confident about what really is happening. Like, even the hormone stages, my God, like the hormone stages and the cycles, and understanding really what that is. It wasn't until I was in my 20s where I could really start to pinpoint, like, and know, like, well, this week I'm going to feel like this potentially. So really preparing for that and understanding, giving myself some grace when that happens, of like, what do I need to do to make myself feel better at that time? And a lot of times, if things aren't brought up or taught at the beginning, then the female will never bring it up herself, right? This is a generational thing that's passed down over and over and over until somebody stops it and actually brings it to light, talks about it, celebrates it, right? Celebrates it is the key word. Like, look at like some African cultures that have like the big rings in their ears and the things are on their necks. Like, those are they have like tribal celebrations for a girl's first period. They have tribal celebrations for the first time someone has sex and intercourse. Like, it's celebrated to like go through these transitions as a young woman. And in our culture, it's not as prominent, right? It's not as celebrated as maybe other places are. And for myself, I really want to encourage everyone on this call to to celebrate those things in your daughters so that we can start to be more open about that and understand each other at a different level. Because there's dramatic shifts in mood and behavior, right? Worst case scenarios are like hostility, like hopeless feelings of depression, like even into suicide. Like people don't know what's happening to their bodies, and it feels like crap. Like 10% or less of people have those type of like really worst case scenario feelings of depression and panic attacks and fear, based on just not understanding what's uncontrollable in their body and how that affects their brain, because literally their brain is changing. Like the nature of their brain is shifting when they go through those hormonal stages. And when you have a team of soccer players in front of you, right, and you have one girl that is just hostile in the moment, how do you handle that? And how do you handle it with not making it wrong? Right? Because at the end of the day, it's not necessarily her fault, because she wasn't taught how to handle that. And so we have to be able to step in as influencers and really talk to that, or at least have conversations with the parents about what that means, right? If you don't feel comfortable to have a conversation with the child and that's not your place, then at least have a conversation with the parent. That's the least you can do, right? Because we need to bring these things to the surface a little bit.
No, and I think you touched when you said give each other and give yourself some grace. I think that's a huge proponent, right? I think we all need to kind of sometimes take a step back and say, what is the purpose? And really like, I'm going to give this person some grace today. I'm going to give this person some grace, because I know at times when I'm coaching, there's definitely days where I'm edgier and I'm like on edge and I just need to get focused down. Or I take those times and I'm like, hey, you know what? Today's a Tuesday. Why not? We're going to lighten up a little bit. And so it really gives, different perspectives and perceptions. And you're kind of almost saying you need to almost mock or simulate or assimilate to my mood, depending on how I'm feeling today. And that's not necessarily the best, coaching scenario anyway. So how do we do this for our, female and male athletes that are coming in with a good day or a bad day, and being able to have that kind of consistency within the sport? And I think, even though these hormones and everything are changing, and the pandemic kind of almost emphasizing it even more of, feeling that lonership and that depression and the anxiety because they don't have that social outlet,
Really
it speaks volumes to what we need to do now and to kind of almost recover from that. And I think these conversations, when they're in this safe place with us and creating that safe space, it's all about the human, right? It's not always about the performance. It's not always about, their development as an athlete. It's their development as a person and who they're becoming, and who you're showing is putting your best foot forward as a mentor. And I think that's huge in terms of like what you're saying, Trish, is just listening and understanding and being able to like have those conversations with the student athlete or the adults.
Yeah. I mean, when we talk about influence, like, and yesterday we talked about, the most influential person for you, like who is that most influential coach? So if these girls are going to remember you in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s as being the most influential coach, it's going to come down to how you build rapport with them. It's going to come down to showing that you care about them as a human before an athlete, and then weaving it into being an athlete and helping them to like perform better as an athlete through the fact that you care about their own human needs, right? Their human development, like how they feel in the day, like are they hydrated, have they eaten anything, like showing like serious care. It touches an emotional part of the person, right? And all of a sudden you're in a position of influence. Like you better bet your butt, like those girls are going to listen to you when it's time to actually act and perform and play. They're going to listen to you when you've developed this foundation of like, okay, I care about you guys, right? Like, and that comes with these types of changes, because this is such a big change in female development, and it happens at this stage. So girls go from, not being interested in boys to being completely interested in boys. Now all of a sudden they're distracted, right? They're distracted on the field. Football team walks by, like everybody's eyes go, right? And like all of a sudden it takes them longer to get ready in the locker room, and they have to put makeup on before the game, and they have to, obviously they're taking their jewelry off for the game, but like there's just different things that they're doing that you'll notice. So it's just important to just be aware of those things.
No, absolutely. And I agree. And I think that goes along with, going through that male puberty as well. And, our stress responses are different, right? I think, during this time and understanding how much anxiety is coming up because of their social status and the dynamics of, am I performing? Am I doing this? And you see all these other, males, getting mustaches or growing at an incredible rate. And maybe you're still small and you have a delayed puberty session. And it's just, where are you comparing yourself? And a lot of boys often do that, right? They compare themselves to their team. They compare themselves to other athletes on the team. And whereas, girls usually have an easier time comparing themselves against themselves and where they're bettering. So when that dynamic happens during male puberty, it's very hard. And that's why they quit the sport, right? They compare themselves to other people. They don't see what their personal best is or their growth trajectory. And so they don't really respond as well and don't really understand how to develop those skills if they're not taught them. And like you were saying, Trisha, is just being able to know that you're trying to get better yourself. You're not necessarily doing this to be better than everybody else. You're just trying to better yourself. And I think that's that same mentality as when, I was just talking to a colleague about like, what made you competitive? And they talked to a sports psychologist and they're like, what was the essence of competitiveness in themselves? And they said, I wanted to win. I wanted to be the best. I wanted to do this. And they succeeded in sports because they always wanted to do that. Mm-hmm. And, he eventually took a year off of, working out and exercising. And, this was after competition. And he was wondering why. And they talked to a sports psychologist and they stated, hey, you know what? You didn't have that competition and you have zero drive for exercise, right? You've changed that lane of just competition into winning in sports. And so that's why you exercise. That's why you participated in sports before, is because you were driven by competition. And now he's taken that same element and brought it to the business world. And so that whole idea of competition and that whole idea of striving to be the best or creating, the most effective product and bettering other groups or people or other products, that's now driving his business. And so being able to kind of see where your competitive edge is and why you compete is a huge driver, and not necessarily understanding of that dynamic piece is what drives you to compete, what drives your athletes to want to compete for you as a coach. And I think that has to do with those relationships that you're talking about, Trisha, is just being able to open up and have them confide in you and have them to be responsive and say, they're going to win for me when the time comes, right? They want to perform for me because I've built that relationship. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of where our kind of motto for Capita has come from is, be the coach players want to play for, be the coach that players want to win for. And it really resembles that whole social emotional aspect and bettering themselves as people, but also understanding them, they're part of a team, not necessarily themselves.
Yeah, you're spot on. Like the competition part, I mean, we'll talk about it later because we have the video in here of that, but building men, not just winning, right? Like the way that you coach is actually building this man to be a good father and a good husband and all those things. So down the line, it's like thinking big picture. That's really important. But there's so many nuances too to competition, right? Because competition for a female and a male is totally different. Like males at this stage in puberty are like more aggressive, right? And they're aggressive in the way in the way they're like through physical action, right? And females just aren't as competitive in that. It's not that they're not competitive, but they're competitive in different ways. And so you'll see that come out at this stage. So I think it's important to just note some of the like nuanced things about sensation seeking, like increases at age 10, and peaks between 13 and 16. I mean, if you're coaching 13 to 16-year-olds, like where are you seeing this happen? And the impulsivity of everything too, which is on this slide here, steadily declines, but guys going through puberty are more impulsive in nature. So it's not making it wrong, just like we didn't make some of the emotional things that females were doing wrong. It's part of the developmental process. So, that kind of stuff comes up in competition. right now. But the idea of competition, I love your story of that, because it does show up in all different ways, and long term it shows up in different ways too. It comes back to that like native and primal instinct for males to be in competition, which is so cool.
And I like what you said about that impulsivity, right? And not really thinking, because, I'm going to go through another kind of context piece is, even when I had delayed puberty as well. I didn't start puberty until I was, freshman, sophomore in high school, I think the end of freshman year. And so going through that at a later stage, I was, I think 5'4" heading into freshman year. And I was playing on a varsity hockey team, knowing that I'm playing with players that are 6'9", and, having this small man syndrome and a chip on my shoulder, being like, all right, I'm going to go after it. I'm going to get in the corners
Like
and really fight for it. Not knowing that the whole size difference is just going to wreck me, and thinking like my skill is just going to outweigh that body of theirs. And, at times it did to an extent, but not to the idea of like, oh, I'm just going to get hit all over the ice and pushed around, right? Because I'm not physically up to that. But that mental idea of, not understanding consequences, not understanding, and just living off of impulse. And this is what coach wants us to do. Let's do it. Right. So it's not necessarily always the healthiest or worst choice, but it's still like you have that drive, and it's internal, and it's not something that you like always think about. It's not at the forefront of your mind.
Well, how did that, if you don't mind sharing like that, because that can be like uncomfortable, right? Is like going through puberty as a male and having things start to happen like that, and realizing like, shit, I'm the smallest one, here. I haven't hit that point yet. Like, was that frustrating for you, or did you not notice it, or?
No, definitely frustrating, right? Like internally, you kind of have to repress those, because that's kind of what the expectation is. And we
Yes.
don't want to have that happen, but at the same time, nobody was there to help me with it, right? They knew I had skill in playing, but that's not necessarily going to be skilled across the whole landscape of my emotions and my feelings and my team and like the dynamics, right? I felt inferior. So I had to step up my other parts of my game in terms of, I have to be more aggressive. I had to do this because, I'm not shy, and I'm not afraid of this 6'9" player, even though I'm 5'4" or whatever it was. Right. I was a scrawny 110, 120 pound person going into a corner with 6'9", 250. It's not an easy task, but you're expected to do that as a player. And, there's players in the NHL that have a huge, massive size difference as well. But, and that's kind of where I took it, right? You look to those models and those mentors of saying like, oh, I'm going to model my game after this person because they are smaller. And so you have to try to find those influences to say, all right, well, if, they can do it, I can do it. Right.
Oh,
and so
I love that you brought that up. That's a really important piece. I think we talk about that later in some of this presentation, is like making sure that females have a person of influence, that, a younger girl, but somebody that's a little bit older, because it really resonates to have somebody to look up to like that, not just the coach, but like another athlete that's similar to them. And same thing with males, especially going through puberty, going through that process. And the other thing that I wanted to mention is, you mentioned the expectation that it's not talked about, right? That it's not. So we have to shift that expectation and be vulnerable to opening up about it. And many of us aren't comfortable talking about that kind of stuff because that's what we grew up with. But unless we make a shift of that now, then other generations will be more open to it. They'll be more open to bringing it up, the fact that I'm really small compared to these other guys right now, right? And not feel like they have to like close off and just kind of go inward and deal with it. It just doesn't serve, you know what I mean?
Right. And especially, in high school, right? You have the 4-year age difference. So there's a whole lot of developing going on
such a good
internally, externally. And so it's a completely different dynamic. So those conversations need to be happening, and no matter what age group. And I think like you're right. And those older kind of leaders, those seniors, juniors, whatever, they need to kind of help those younger classes out. And that should be the expectation, rather than like, well, just go up and practice and you guys will be friends. You're on a team, you'll be friends. That's not true. We all know high school is totally different in that sense. So, being able to have those leaders and almost speak to that, right? And I think we talk about this a little bit later too, of like who are those captains and who are those kind of leadership and those models that will help guide some of these younger athletes or those people that are struggling developmentally in those situations.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, and that kind of goes along with this next development piece that Trish is going to get into a little bit more. So go ahead.
Yeah, this development piece is so fascinating. This woman, Allison Armstrong, if you want to look her up, she's she can take you through it even deeper than what I'll go through today. I'll really just go through kind of the surface level piece, but it's important to see the stages of a man. You know, they start as a page, kind of born until, this is from when someone is like from birth until puberty. So this would be like what we talked about yesterday, coming right into this transition of going through puberty, because they're in a fun and adventurous state, but they're all about challenge, right? So up until puberty and almost into puberty, they're all about challenge, the pages, right? They're kind of like knight wannabes, if I can say that, like meaning that they're looking up to the next level, these knights, and they're like, man, I want to be like that. That's why I'm saying, you know, finding role models for them that are in that knight stage, that have already been through that puberty process and are maybe at the next level of their performance in sport. It's like really having someone for them to look up to, or coming to have people come in to speak to the team, right? Having like, I know there's so many football teams out there, like U of M has a program where they go in and all of the athletes go in and talk at schools and things. And that like creates this like, oh my gosh, well, I could become this, right? Like, it's just so cool. What else did I want to mention here? Like at this stage, at the page stage, like the boys really drive their moms crazy, and they likely drive their coaches crazy too. Like they're the ones that are like, well, it's an adventure for them, right? So it's like, can I balance this thing on my head while I go from here to there? Like they're literally testing themselves and challenging themselves constantly. It's like, can I shove my brother down the banister in a laundry basket, you know, and can he make it successfully? Like, let's just go, right? We all know those kids. That's this stage. And so it's important to see the transition between a page into a knight and what that looks like. So if you can tap into the desire for a sense of challenge with these pages, then you can, if you can relate to them, right, as you're coaching them, it's like, how can you relate to challenging them so that they are, because they're so keen on that. So you can use that as a tactic to get them to try other things and do other things in sport, to engage them in a challenging way, because that's where they're at. And then you go, go ahead.
Sorry, Trish, I was thinking, yeah, it's very, I mean, almost simple, right? To get these boys and men to really compete. And I think that's the point, right? Like if I'm tired and I don't want to play really hard with my son who's 3.5, I'll be like, I'll time you. And that's like the easiest, the most simple trick to do. Like, I'm going to time you. You do 10 laps around the kitchen, and they'll just go do it, right? And it's the same thing with teenage boys. Well, you be like, all right, who's faster? And you guys have them race around the script. There's your sprints, right? You get to these challenges and you have these small area games or compete and have these kind of small competitions to get what you want out of them. But it's that sense of challenge and that competition that drives them, because everything they do at this stage is all about, it's almost challenging their manhood essentially. And people want to have that. And I say that in a non kind of gendered way, because it's challenging who they are as a person essentially. And it's really saying like, who are you? Are you going to be the person that kind of just falls over and gets on your back, or are you going to actually push through this and show your toughness? And I think that's the huge driver in this stage, because it's something that it's easy, but it's simplified, and it's broken down to that, like you were saying before, almost that cultural piece, but also that heritage and where we were hunters, right? Yeah. We wanted to always go out and hunt and kill and show everybody that we're the ones that take down the biggest beast or whatever it was.
Totally. No, that's such a good point. I love the timing your son thing. It's so true. Because at that stage, there's not as much emotional concept, right? They're more about their body and where their body is in space and what they can challenge themselves with their body. And then you go into the night stage, and granted, like the guys, this isn't like hard and fast rules on ages. So just I'm giving age ranges, but obviously you can't look at someone and be like, oh, he's 8, so he must be a page or a night, right? Like, so just take that with a grain of salt. But then you get into the night stage, which is puberty to the late 20s, early 30s even. And now all of a sudden, it's not that you're not challenge isn't something that you desire, but it's you're more adrenaline based. You're in search of the thrills, right? The big things that are going to be like crazy. You're pursuing women, right? So your emotional self is starting to develop even more. And this is at this time is when you have some of the highest levels of testosterone ever. And so your body is like literally changing by the day, going through this developmental process. And the nights are more so going out and enjoying the world, right? They're going and exploring different things and trying new things. And so this is like it's a really long stage. But then you go into the Prince stage. But even before we get there, like, I just want to note, like the stage of the night, every single man, no matter how age, all the way into when they are older in their 80s, they will always have this night stage. So just like King Arthur would suit up and go into battle at any point, it's the same thing. Like that adrenaline rush, that doesn't disappear. It doesn't just stop with the night phase. It goes through all the phases. And then there's like different pieces to each phase. So in the Prince stage, which is the last one that I'll touch on, because it does kind of go into more collegiate level athletes. Like at that stage, there's usually about 10 to 13 years of this Prince stage, because there's 3 different Prince stages, right? There's an early Prince, there's a middle Prince, and there's a late Prince. And now granted, like I said, the time frames of this are just pretty malleable. Like you're not going to be able to just pinpoint someone, but you can recognize some of the pieces of this stage. Like the Prince is figuring out where they want to build their kingdom. So you can see like people in college, men in college, boys, men, whatever stage they're at, they are figuring out what they like and how they're going to develop their empire. They're like, do I like technology? Like they're thinking about profession, right? So it's not just that they're in sport anymore. And all of a sudden their minds are going to like relationships and right. And so knowing when that starts to happen and just recognizing it can help you coach them better, because they are not so much solely focused on sport anymore. They are using other things and exploring other pieces. They're figuring out like, well, if I like architecture, do I like to do architecture that's in this area or this area? And they're exploring different things within each thing. So the Prince stage could take days or it could take years and years and years. It's just developing where you want to build your kingdom. And then a middle Prince is building their kingdom. They're building their resources. They're creating this niche. So you see sometimes like into a middle Prince, we have a lot of college age men that have children now. And so you see that in college football and college everything, right? Like people have kids at young ages sometimes. And so you might be working with an athlete that has a child at home. And that's like something that's a totally different way to but work with that person, as opposed to maybe working with someone that doesn't have kids, right? So it just opens up all these different types of coaching and influence that you could have on them. Yeah, I guess that's about as far as I'll go with that, because going into the tunnel and into the king stage is just later years, but I just wanted you to see that on here.
I think it's so prominent and so impactful, just because knowing where these developmental stages happen in different ways, right? Like we talked about like the physical developments with, long-term athletic development models. And then we talk about, different mental models and so on. And, we can get into, psychology and child development, but I think it's so important to see different perceptions of what that looks like. And you'll see some of these kind of habits and these kind of pieces show up, not necessarily all at once, but just bits and pieces everywhere within, the children you're coaching. And, male and female, they're a lot alike. And I think, in this developmental stage, the men in this situation have a little bit of a difference where it is like it's more focused. It's less about the cross brain activity. It's more about that linear thing, because that's, you have to be this breadwinner, you have to do this because of these kind of niche things that I wouldn't say niche, but the stereotypical kind of path that we're on. And we just have to be able to understand where those are coming from, because we're oftentimes forced into these positions, not even meaning to be, but because society expects us to be. And so we have to kind of be able to break those barriers down as coaches, and have those conversations of like, this person's here, and now I want to know why and what's going on, and how can I help you, and how can I get you to, the next stage or to the next phase of your life, and move on, and be able to reflect on those pieces as well.
Yeah, totally. It's awesome.
And so one of those things that we wanted to do too is during the stage is thinking about what we just learned, and not only with the puberty parts and the, the developmental stages, but where's that coaching piece come in, right? Male athletes tend to be more confused or convinced, and sometimes deluded of their own prowess and like their skills, right? I know I was thinking like I was going to be the best. And so oftentimes I was less coachable because I thought I knew everything.
Yeah.
And so you almost challenge the coach to show you that they know more than you. And it becomes this one-up game, right? Well, I don't agree with this. So, are you credible? Are you somebody that I should follow into this? And I think that's a huge thing. And almost it becomes resistance to coaching, because they think that they have this, I don't know, that the world revolves around them, as well as, they already know everything. And so why not? And every teenager has that stage of, they're the egotistical center of the world, and everything should revolve around them because they're, the second coming, whatever it may be. It's how we coach that, and how do we embrace that? So sometimes they'll challenge you as a coach. They'll challenge you to say, you're wrong, because they think they know. And
Yes.
they'll want to make you feel like you're inferior to them, and it's not a linear kind of thing, or it's not like a pyramid type of power. So how can you understand to get the most out of them is creating that agency and that autonomy, and give them voice, right? When can they be creative? When can they have a voice in the practice or games, and in those situations where it's not necessarily you always telling them and them trying to defend themselves, or them trying to be, one-upping you as a coach, but how can you really take that approach and say, this is what's desired now, and this is where we want to go. How do we get there? And have that conversation. So you get to see where their perspective and their point of view is, and then you guys can have those conversations in terms of that, right? You want to build those relationships first and have them trust you before you kind of challenge them. But at the same time, it's almost like a force of credibility, right? And you don't want to get into that. Your credibility should not rely on you arguing with an athlete on your team, right? It doesn't matter in the end of the day what's going to happen. It's how you're challenging them, how are you motivating them, and how are you building those relationships. So being able to coach them and, in the team dynamic and the team atmosphere is going to be more keen in terms of building that individual growth too.
Yeah. And I just want to touch on the challenge piece, because like you mentioned, they're going to want to challenge the coach, but the coach can also challenge them in ways that's going to resonate, which is really helping them to challenging them to rise up based on other people, right? Like females will tend to like challenging within themselves. It's like putting, if I did this time, I want to do this time better.
Personal
I think
best,
they're
yeah.
more self-involved, whereas like the males want to compare themselves to the other teammates. So if the coach knows that and can use that to challenge, I mean, the most influential people in the world, Martin Luther Kings of the world, right? One thing that they do very well is they challenge the status quo. They challenge the people to rise up and to think differently, right? And to teach them how to think. So when you know this about the males and going through these developmental stages, you can really work with them in a way that helps them to rise up better than they maybe would otherwise. So cool.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's almost very, very unique to females as well, is they want to have that teamwork, or they want to have that team dynamic. And how do they fit in with the team? Like they're personally growing, and they understand their sense of self almost way better than a male, because they don't have that same kind of prowess, and they don't have that, like, I'm the best, I'm going to be the best on the team.
Correct.
And occasionally there are those,
Mhm.
alpha females in that sense, but most of the time they know their ability way more than males do. Males kind of ideology is pretty diluted in that fact that, like, everybody's, team captain, everybody's the number one on the team or the leading
Right.
goal scorer. They should be, right? But they just haven't had the chances, or they haven't gotten enough playing time. But in females, they're much more aware of who they are and their kind of place within the team, whether it be that, starter, or that, the main, like the leading scorer, right? They know that if they're a third liner or they're on the bench or whatever, they know their kind of place, and they want the team to succeed. They think more about the team and the success of the team, less than their success as an individual athlete, saying like, well, I scored 3 goals, I did my part, right? Or I scored 26 points today, I did my part.
Right.
Whereas people was like, did we win? I don't know, like it didn't. So,
Yeah, exactly. That's so true. Oh my gosh. And females tend to be, I shouldn't say tend to, but tend to be more coachable, right? Because of that, because they are looking inward and they are like, do whatever. But the men do like to challenge the coach more.
absolutely. And so it really goes into, when we talk about men and women, we don't want to kind of say this is based off specifically gender, right? There's these tendencies, and there's these kind of masculine and feminine tendencies, but we also don't like to use those terms either, right? Like, we want to kind of break that stereotype of male, female, masculine, feminine. And even though masculine and feminine aren't really talking about gender specific, that's what we associate them with. And so we want to kind of really bring that down to even another notch and saying like alpha, omega, what is this scale? And everybody's on a different part of this scale, right? There are going to be, alphas that completely take over a conversation, completely take over a room, completely demand things from certain people. And then there are omegas who are kind of, more subdued. And I think it's not your one or the other, it's where are you on this kind of spectrum? And I think it's not even, I'd almost say it's like a cycle, right? Like it shifts back and forth, and it's not necessarily you're stuck here and this is where you're always going to be. Maybe in this situation at work, you're here as an alpha, or maybe at, during sports, you're this person over here in an omega. And it just depends on the dynamic and where you see yourself. And so I think it definitely shifts depending on your cultural space and where you feel comfortable with. But yeah, that's also something we need to start challenging too.
Oh my gosh, yeah. I mean, it's all on a scale based on the situation sometimes. Sometimes it's you're more in your alpha or more in your omega based on the person that you're around, right? Because you're polarizing each other always. So when somebody walks in and dominates a room, do you shift into omega? Do you meet that person at their alpha at eye level and go into just this like, like this, you can see different scenarios, and I'm sure you're thinking of different things that have happened in the past where you showed up with an alpha, and it's like, oh shit, right? And either is okay. It's not wrong. There's nothing wrong, but we all have these, which is why, like you said, we don't like to use masculine and feminine, because it's not that only males are alpha and only females are omega. So there's just I love the word spectrum that you use, because that's exactly what it is. So it's like, do you really know where your team ranges? Like as a team, do you have a more alpha team or do you have a more omega team? And like, what does that mean? Do they work really well? And when do you need them to shift into their alpha mode? Because like there might be some games that they might be a little bit nervous, or they might be a little bit hesitant, and they have like somebody that's really good on the team. And so how do you get them to step into their alpha where they're in more command of themselves, right? Than not. It's like you as the coach are leading this and directing this. So you are always in your alpha. Alpha is always about structure, right? It's about setting the time structure, setting the structure of the actual day, what practice is going to look like. That's the alpha container. And then the omega piece is the flow and the creativity of what's happening in that, and exploring different things about themselves and what they can and can't do. And so it's just really interesting. But I would, like, if you had to rate yourself on a scale of 0 to 10, where do you sit in this when you're coaching? Are you coaching more in your omega, or are you coaching more in your alpha? my guess is it's more alpha because there are structure pieces that are just innately a coach, right? But when do you come down into your omega, and not down in terms of like being bad or worse or whatever, but when do you shift into your omega to meet somebody at their omega? If you have a girl that's in tears right after a game, are you going to stay in your alpha, or are you going to resonate with that female to get on their level and really like be able to talk to them and hash out something that maybe needs to be had? So just really playing into that. And then do your team captains take on one of those complementary roles? Like, what role is best for your, maybe you have a more omega team. Like, do you have somebody that's in that alpha state that's coming on as a team captain? Like, this will help you select your person so that you have some polarity there, which is very good for the team and healthy for the team. What else did I want to mention here?
Like almost looking at your team dynamics, right? Like that can help you, like you're saying, like choose those team captains or choose those team leaders that you can lean on, right? Like there's certain points that you want an alpha, or there's certain points that you need an omega, and how do you really choose these leaders on your team to step up, and when do you choose them to be like, hey, you need to go address this, or can you help with this, can you take this on, and that almost helps you decide sometimes on who those captains or those leaders should be, right? Because they either relate really well and with those teammates, and they can like nurture some of the more personable things out of them, or they're the ones that driving that motivation piece and driving that success in terms of performance and those aspects and that structure. So it's that fine line of finding that balance and who you want to kind of take those leadership roles and push them onto your team / who can you trust in those situations, right? And it is building the trust between you and those leaders, as well as those leaders and the team and the rest of the team, kind of being your voice from afar.
Yeah, and then just the last thing before we move on here, because I know we have quite a bit to get through still, but also looking at it for the individual, right? Because this really comes into play, like knowing your teammates extremely well will be looking at them from this lens, right? It's like, is this person, because everybody knows like a bodybuilder that has very feminine characteristics once they start talking and are emotionally involved, right? But they look at their body as being, oh, that person is just like, damn, that person is jacked or whatever. And they're in their body is in an alpha state, but their actual mind is very feminine. And so if you know your athletes well enough, you'll be able to like kind of play with that a little bit and make it so that they're showing up their best based on their natural characteristics, which is just a beautiful thing.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I know you kind of touched on some of these points, but yeah, driving this home, like, what does an alpha look like, right? Where's that posture coming in? Who's assuming the responsibility of, everybody, and really, how do we get them to perform at their best? And what does that look like? And what do you want out of that? And so being able to identify yourself in the alpha state and where you see your team leaders as well as your team, and how do we embody this alpha, and where do we want to see it the most? Where do we want to see it as we kind of push through to the next level of our coaching, but also where do you want to increase your alpha, and where do you want to increase that kind of energy? And maybe it's something where you're like, well, I know on Sunday practices, we're all kind of, in this omega state, just like it's a weekend, but where can we really get into some of those harder hitting things if you need it, right? And really those kind of like the alpha mentality of like, we need more energy, we need more structure, we need more kind of motivation on these days because we're not getting it.
Right. Well, the one thing I want to point out here is this last bullet, which is most nourished by emptying, spending time alone, being in a meditative state, resting in quiet, anything that's really relaxing. Like men typically, or people in their alpha, right? Because I've been in an alpha for a long time, being self-employed. I'm constantly in charge, right? I'm in charge of myself. I'm in charge of my team, my staff. Like I'm in an alpha role when I'm at work. And so being nourished for me sometimes is when I get home, like my partner knows not to have the TV on, because the TV to me is it's just bonkers noise. I've been, leading all day and my head is exposed. Like for me, even though I'm a female, I recharge by being in quiet and being in silence. And so what is that for you? Like, how do you allow your team to feel nourished after a game that maybe they just lost and really sucked at, honestly, right? Like if you have a group of alpha athletes, maybe giving them some quiet time to really like reflect on what's going on and like wind down for a second is better before you hard charge and go in to talk about what really happened in that game, right? And then we'll go to the females too, because the females are totally different.
The Omega, yeah.
Or the Omega, I'm sorry.
We do that. It happens. And it's just,
Lots
you
of
know,
my words, I know.
right. It just, we always want to talk about it and bring it up, but
I know
ourselves, right? That's the point. And I think that's the same thing is, I kind of want to touch on that. Like if you're coming in hard charging as a coach after a loss, you know, if you're dealing with a bunch of alphas and they gave it their all and you are going to be like, that was the worst game I've ever seen you play, that's not going to do anything, right? That's not going to help them. That's not going to support them. That's just going to make them feel even worse. And so, you know, is that a motivator for them? Probably not. So making sure that you understand those motivation techniques and how to address those specific things within these groups. So understanding and identifying your alphas, your omegas, and how to approach them individually as well as a team, because the team dynamic is definitely different than an individual dynamic. And so being able to understand that is a huge piece as well.
Yes. Yeah. So then going into the omega piece, like they're more nourished by filling up and like having conversations with loved ones, like talking about what happened at the game with other teammates afterwards, instead of going into quiet time. Typically, right? This is all typical. Enjoying creative experiences or experiences of awe. So that's how they feel nourished. Now, you know, there's definitely a difference between this, and hopefully you're starting to see and come up with a few people that, you know, are in these qualities or have these specific qualities. But the omega side, they are more nurturing, they're vulnerable and expressive, they sensitize to an extreme degree. They have self-confidence and self-awareness that the alpha sometimes doesn't notice about themselves. And so, or when they're in their alpha, right, they're just in a command state, they're not thinking about those types of things. Whereas when you're in your omega state, you are very reflective and things like that.
Yeah, and I think sometimes we almost, and we also put this term like that feminine, right? Because it's almost so closely related to this, you know, mothering and nurturing nature, but not necessarily is it always going to be a female doing so. And I think males oftentimes think this is like a sign of weakness when they are nurturing or when they're supportive of each other. But I know for myself, like if I have teammates supporting me, or if I have, you know, a coach supporting me, be like, oh, you got this, it's fine. Like, I understand that was a rough one, but that makes you feel so much better than if you're like, that sucked. Like that was awful. Right. So being able to understand this is not a male versus female type of atmosphere. It is, you know, understanding the dynamics of team and energies and personalities and characteristics, and being able to understand what's best for each individual is going to be what's best for you as a coach.
Yes.
Because I do, like, as a male and as a coach and growing up in a very alpha environment in terms of, you know, performance and hockey at the highest level, it's thinking, you know, all this kind of social emotional piece is almost like I'm going to stereotype this in a way, but I think it's the most important thing is we see it as like a weakness, right? You shouldn't be talking about your emotions in this way. You shouldn't be talking and sharing your emotions, because it's showing vulnerability and weakness, and people will take advantage of it. But that's not how we grow. That's not how we know and figure out who we are, especially during this kind of pre-adolescence, adolescence, and these growing years where we're still trying to build and find out our self-identity and self-awareness. So I think it's something that we have to nurture and care for as a coach, and show them that it's okay to do that, and really show the benefits of it. And that's why we see a huge number of anxiety and depression cases increase over not only this pandemic, but over time with these adolescents, is because of how much pressure and stress we put on them to fit into these different molds where it's not healthy. And we really need to find those balances and ways to unwind and to take care of ourselves as well.
Right. Like we said, not making it wrong, right? Not making any way of being wrong.
Right. I mean, it's exactly, you're just being, right? You're living
Yeah.
and doing all that. And so, just kind of to summarize those type of attitudes, it is finding a balance. It is finding that spectrum that works for you, right? We want to normalize that masculinity and femininity, so it's not necessarily a combative issue. It's, alpha omega. It's we have all these traits and everybody has these traits. And so that's kind of why I want to almost bring up this activity with you guys, is thinking about almost addressing this gender stripped theory almost. And so I just asked my colleague too about some of these questions, and it made him feel very uncomfortable, but that's kind of the point, right? Is, we go into the situation, and this is a situation that, maybe you may feel uncomfortable, but if you go into a restroom, right, and you're a male or female, and you run out of toilet paper in the stall, what would you do?
I would ask the person next to me, hey, you got any toilet paper?
Yeah, right. A male would definitely not ask that. And I just asked my colleague that just to be sure. And I was like, because I know I wouldn't, but I wanted to make sure like other people would feel the same way.
That's
but
so
they're not
funny.
going out there and saying, hey, I need toilet paper. And he even said, specified, he's like, well, it depends on what I'm doing next. And I was like, what? Why does that, like, how does that matter, first of all? But, we still have to figure out what's going to happen next in this situation.
Oh my God.
And so being able to identify the ability to be vulnerable and say, hey, I need some help, or I need some, toilet paper.
Ask for support.
A completely different trajectory of, like, in a male's sense of, no, I'm not doing that. Why would I ask for help? Like, thinking going out of the stall without toilet paper and not wiping or whatever, it's a very, interesting perspective of what a male would do, just because they don't want to avoid, or they want to avoid that conversation of being vulnerable.
Correct.
And so it almost blows my mind at some of this stuff. And there's different questions you can ask people, but that's one of those really interesting kind of concepts of breaking those types of things down.
Well, and it's really important, and I know we're running out of time here, but like to look at the wounded piece, like this is more wounded omega, wounded alpha, because this could show up. And obviously, like, I know I've avoided things in the past. Like, let's be completely honest, and been in a control mode. I mean, there's so many pieces of this that become toxic, right? And so we have to be aware of what's toxic and what's healthy in each part of the spectrum within each individual, and as a team and as a collective. Like, are we going into more control and being like abusing our power as being the best in our, in our soccer across the board? Like, maybe we are number one right now. It's like that could get to the head and become toxic, even though typically it's like a really good thing, right? It's how do you stay in this like natural masculine state, and you're more supportive and you feel stable, versus being in control and being like hyper competitive almost to a toxic degree, and like boasting about it, right? So being able to like pinpoint when people are in that toxic space and when it's healthy.
Oh, absolutely. I love that too. And so I know Trish and I mentioned this a little bit yesterday, but understanding those social influences and your influence, right? What does that look like, and how does that come off? And so being able to understand how that's changing this person, right? How are these projections or those expectations really changing their behavior, your behavior as a coach, and the dynamics of the team, right? All these different influences, economic, your gender, your race, your ethnicity, your kind of socioeconomic status. So it has a lot to do with it. And how are we responsive for that, and being responsive to those things, and not necessarily plugging them into this is my coaching strategy, you need to fall within that, right? You coach to your players and not to your system. And I think that's what we need to start taking away, is even though you may have some great strategies or techniques, your players may not fit that mold. They may challenge you because they are either developmentally not there, physically not there, and they may not understand something. So being able to adapt and be flexible as a coach, and really understanding your influence on them, is going to help you down the line much more than in creating more impact than it is just being like, well, we had an unsuccessful season because we didn't win because you didn't listen to me, right? Yeah. That's not the way those dynamics should work.
Right. And like overall, like looking at like big picture, you see females stepping into more masculine roles, right? And the roles are kind of swapping, where a lot of males are staying at home with the kids now. And so like when you have college age athletes that have gone through puberty already, but are stepping into now demonstrating more masculine characteristics in terms of their career and profession and what they're choosing to do, all those social influences, like you said, really play a huge part in your ability to influence them, which is really, really cool. It's a great opportunity.
No, and that kind of brings us to a last kind of clip that Tricia mentioned before is, Jim Harbaugh does an excellent job in terms of speaking to this. And even though he runs a very biased, I'm a very large and big Michigan fan, but even though he runs this very successful Michigan program, people sometimes question because he doesn't always create, the 13-0s, the national champions, but he creates better humans. And I think this trailer for, I think it's an Amazon Prime show, it was kind of like behind the scenes, all or nothing, just speaks to that, right? It's what he's doing as a coach to make these people better, not necessarily better at football, but better humans and better people for the world beyond the sport. So we'll watch this quick clip. It's just a trailer for the show. So hopefully you guys go back and watch it, because support Michigan sports and athletics, especially in the Sweet 16.
The Michigan experience changes you. I said, Coach, what kind of team we're going to have this year? He said, Jimmy, when you guys come back 15, 20 years from now, and we know what kind of men you are, what kind of husbands you become, what kind of fathers you are, then we'll know how good this football team is. Let's go work! Let's compete! I want to bring this 2017 season to life. Be tougher, be nasty, be mean. It's the dark side, I get it. I see some of you looking at me like, you got problems, man.
It's quite a circus in the Harbaugh house.
Daddy, are you sure you're the boss of this place?
No, I'm not sure about that.
What do you want to do when you leave here?
Play in the NFL.
And I think that's awesome, but we all know that NFL stands for what?
Not for long.
Not for long.
Let's go! Let's go, Woo! You play for the winningest football program of all time!
From a parent's perspective, we worry all the time.
I'm going to take care of your boy.
You ever talk to your dad?
Not at all.
Does he ever call you? You got somebody who love you with everything they have, because I got your back.
All we ask is everything you got.
I want so much for you.
Faith, family, football.
Let's get this win!
Yeah, and I just love that. And just the influence that coaches can have, and just showing that these players will give all or nothing to these coaches that really care for them as people beyond the field and beyond the gridiron or whatever sport you're playing. And just being able to understand there is life outside of this sport. And so being able to identify that within your athletes too.
Yeah, so important. I think that it says it all in a nutshell right there.
So kind of to leave you some last thoughts too is relationships do matter, and the coach the human and not the athlete, and using sport as the vehicle to coach that human. We all have that passion, we all have that drive, and allow us to use the sport to be that vehicle of change, and not necessarily allowing the sport to take over the human and the athlete. So one last quote, and then I'm going to kind of do some plugs. But the daily task is marked by self-improvement and the search for new opportunity. And this was, a quote that I like to use often, because Zaza is a clothing brand, but they do things in a much different way. And I highly encourage you to look this up, because it's such a interesting kind of formula that they've created in terms of fashion and the way that they're producing things. But this quote, I feel like, is finding new opportunities to improve every single day by 1%, by 0.5%. Always continue to seek improvement, no matter if it's yourself, somebody around you. Seek those relationships out that help you improve, and build those relationships that are stronger and make you better, and your student athletes better.
Yeah, I mean, I celebrate anybody that's watching this right now, because this was a part of it. So, kudos to you for showing up.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, as we kind of get forward, there's definitely some other opportunities for us to engage, especially if you like this session. Thank you, Trisha, for your expertise and joining us for these last 2 days. It was a pleasure. I know she's going through a lot of work right now beyond just this, but she took some time out of her, very hectic schedule to join us and help us with this.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. But as you guys go on and check out some more work, we have a rise in women in sports. We briefly mentioned it, throughout this kind of clinic, but please check it out. I know there is some issues heading with our way with, the NCAA and their kind of lack of facilities compared to the males, but there are serious pushes for equity and equality in the sports realm right now. So please be sure to check that out in May. The next one is, connecting organizations to industry partners. Is how do we continue to build a community, and how do we get industry to have that buy-in to not only support our community or our organization, but to understand that we can benefit them as well, and we can create that pipeline for not only talent, but people that are creating success in that community and those marketing tactics as well for them. And then from traditional sports from non-traditional sports and traditional sports, and understanding the trends of where sports are going. And is it becoming more individualistic? Is it leaning towards esports and action sports again? Where are the kind of big trends heading, and how can we adjust to them, and how can we cater our athletics and our learning to those kind of trends? Because it's not necessarily taking our athletes away, but it's allowing them to become more multifaceted and a multi-sport athlete rather than just sport-specific athletes. And again, we have some retreats coming up this summer, so please look out on our website, mindspark.org/retreats. It has some, or Mindspark retreats. Sorry, it has some really cool things that we plan on either for July and September of this next year. So please check it out. Definitely some vacation mode reflection pieces for you. But once again, we'll leave you. Thanks again for joining. There is the survey link at the bottom. And if you ever need to reach out to us, please use my email, davis@mindspark.org. We changed our domain, so it's always confusing to remember which one is which. And then also trishaturns@gmail.com. So please, if you have any questions for Trisha or myself, always feel free to reach out. We're here. We want to support you in your next challenge. But thanks again, and enjoy your Wednesday.